there was a time, not so very long ago, in the measure of centuries, when the Queen of England did not nurse her own children. Neither did the Queen of France, nor the Duchess of Burgundy, nor the Countess of any considerable estate. It was not that these women were incapable of nursing. It is not that they were indifferent to their infants, though history has sometimes painted them so. It was, rather, that the feeding of a royal or noble child from the mother's own body was considered by the physicians and the philosophers and the lords of court alike to be not merely unnecessary but actively dangerous. Dangerous to the mother's health, dangerous to the dynasty, and dangerous in ways that might take years to manifest, to the character and temperament of the child himself. The women who fed these children instead were not shadows or afterthoughts. They were chosen with extraordinary care, examined by physicians, governed by contracts, housed in castle rooms of their own, fed at tables separate from both the servants and the nobility, and paid wages that could transform the fortune of a modest family within a single year. They were called wet nurses. Nay, and for the most part, history has forgotten them almost entirely. Consider what it means to forget a person who fed a king. There is something in this forgetting that tells us a great deal about how the medieval world, and indeed the modern world, thinks about women's bodies and women's labour. The wet nurse did not write letters. She did not commission portraits. She did not endow churches or found monasteries, or have her name inscribed in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, except occasionally, in passing, in the household account books of the great families she served. She was, in the most literal sense, present at the beginning of every royal life, and yet she has been almost entirely absent from the stories we tell about those lives. Her milk became the blood of kings, at least according to the medical thinking of the time, and yet her name is rarely spoken. This is a story about her. It is a story about what she ate and what she wore and where she slept, and how she was chosen and what she was paid and what became of her own children while she nursed another woman's child. It is a story about the texture of a life that was intimate and strange, and economically precarious, and yet, in its own quiet way, enormously consequential. Begin with the body, because the body is where this story begins. A woman becomes capable of producing milk when she gives birth. This is not a mystery but a biological fact that the medieval world understood imperfectly, filtered through the lens of ancient Greek and Roman medicine, particularly through the works of Galen, whose theories about the body remained authoritative throughout the medieval period in a way that is difficult for us, living in an age of rapid scientific revision, to fully appreciate. Galen had written, following Aristotle, that breast milk was transformed blood, that the same substance which had nourished the fetus through the umbilical cord was, after birth, redirected upward through the body to the breasts, where it was whitened and thickened by a process he described in terms that were partly physiological and partly alchemical. This theory had a profound consequence for how medieval people thought about wet nursing, because if milk was transformed blood, then it carried within it the qualities of the woman whose blood had made it. It carried her temperament. It carried her moral character. It carried, potentially, her vices and her virtues, her courage or her cowardice, her restraint or her sensuality. The infant who drank from her breast was not merely being nourished, he was being formed. This belief, that milk-shaped character, was not a superstition held only by the uneducated. It was taught in the medical schools of Bologna and Salerno. It was repeated in the conduct manuals written for noble households. It was assumed in the contracts that governed wet nursing arrangements, which often specified not only the physical health of the nurse, but her moral standing in her community, her temperament, her speech, even the colour of her hair and complexion, which were read as signs of humoral balance or imbalance. A red-haired woman was thought to have milk that was too hot and might overstimulate the child. A pale, thin woman might have milk that was too cold or too watery. The ideal nurse was described in text after text as being of medium build, rosy-cheeked, between the ages of roughly 20 and 35, of good character, moderate appetite, and calm disposition. She should not be given to anger, for anger curdled the milk. She should not drink wine to excess, though moderate wine was often prescribed as beneficial to milk production. She should not engage in sexual intercourse because sexual activity was believed to corrupt the milk and could, in theory, cause another pregnancy, which would render her milk unsuitable entirely. This prohibition on sexual activity was one of the most practically consequential aspects of the wet nurse's life inside the castle, and we will return to it, but first consider the process by which a wet nurse was found. When a royal or noble infant was expected, preparations for the wet nurse began well in advance of the birth, sometimes months before the mother's confinement. In England, records from the royal household show that the selection of a wet nurse for a prince or princess could involve the king's own physicians, the queen's ladies, and sometimes the queen herself, though the queen was also understood to have little practical authority over the final decision, which ultimately rested with the senior officers of the household. Candidates were drawn from a specific social stratum, neither too low nor too high. A wet nurse for a royal infant needed to be respectable enough that her character could be vouched for, but she was almost never a woman of the nobility herself. She was typically the wife of a prosperous tradesman, a minor official, a yeoman farmer, or occasionally a lesser merchant. She needed to have recently given birth herself. Her own infant was the proof that her milk had come in, and she needed to have produced enough milk that there was, in theory, a surplus beyond what her own child required. The examination of candidates was a formal process, conducted by physicians and by senior women of the household who had experience in such matters. The milk itself was examined. Medieval physicians described methods of testing milk quality that range from the practical to the peculiar. One common test involved dropping a small amount of milk onto a fingernail held parallel to the ground and observing whether it ran off quickly, which indicated that the milk was too thin and watery, or clung in a rounded drop, which indicated the right consistency. Another test involved tasting the milk. It should be neither too sweet nor too salty, neither too thick nor too thin, and should have a clean, fresh smell. The colour was assessed. Good milk was described as white, verging on bluish-white, and should not be yellowish or greyish. The woman's nipples were also examined. For practicality as much as aesthetics, they needed to be of a size and shape that the infant could latch onto without difficulty, and any signs of cracking, infection, or abnormality would disqualify a candidate immediately. Beyond the physical examination, the candidate's personal history was investigated. Had she lost previous infants? This was a complicated question. Infant mortality was so common in the medieval period that the loss of a child was not automatically disqualifying, but a woman who had lost several children in rapid succession might be suspected of having milk that was constitutionally unsuitable for infants. Was she known in her community as a woman of good character? Did her husband consent to the arrangement? And this was crucial, because the prohibition on sexual intercourse meant that her husband would be required to abstain as well, or rather she would be living away from him in the castle, and the question of his behaviour was somewhat separate from hers. Had she any history of illness that might indicate an underlying weakness? Did she have, as the manuals put it, a face that was neither too ugly nor too beautiful? Ugliness suggesting unhealthy humours, excessive beauty suggesting vanity and its attendant vices. It was a strange and intimate scrutiny, this examination, and it was undergone by women who had little power to refuse it if they wished to obtain the position. The wages paid to a royal wet nurse were, by the standards of the time, extraordinary. In England in the 14th and 15th centuries, a wet nurse for a royal child might earn several pounds per year in direct wages, supplemented by room, board, clothing, and gifts that could more than double the effective value of the arrangement. For the wife of a craftsman or a minor official, this represented a transformation of the family's financial position. The husband might receive a payment as well in recognition of the inconvenience, or more precisely the continence, that was required of him. The family's status in their community would be enhanced simply by the association with the royal household. When the nurse's service ended, she often departed with gifts of cloth, money, and sometimes a formal acknowledgement of her service that could serve as a kind of social credential for the rest of her life. And yet the cost she paid was also significant, and it was paid in the currency that the medieval world least valued when it came to women of the lower orders: her own child's welfare. Here is a thing that is rarely mentioned in the chronicles and the household accounts. When a woman was engaged as a wet nurse for a royal or noble infant, the milk that she produced, milk that her own body had made in response to the birth of her own child, was redirected. Her own infant, if it survived at all, was typically fed by another woman, a less expensive arrangement. Sometimes a village woman paid a small wage, sometimes a neighbour, sometimes fed on animal milk or the thin gruel of bread, water or ale that was given to infants who could not be nursed. The mortality rate among infants fed on pap was significantly higher than among nursed infants. The medieval world knew this at some level and didn't much discuss it. The records do not typically note what became of the wet nurse's own child. The household accounts record the nurse's wages and her food allowances, and the gifts given to her at the end of her service. They do not record whether her infant at home survived the months of her absence. This is one of the silences of history that becomes audible when you listen for it. Inside the castle, the wet nurse occupied a position that was difficult to classify. She was not a servant in the ordinary sense. She did not clean rooms or carry wood or wait at table. Neither was she a member of the household in the fuller sense of the word, with its implications of permanent attachment and social standing. She was something between a temporary resident of high importance, housed in rooms near the nursery, attended by her own servant if the infant was sufficiently important, given special food allowances that reflected the understanding that what she ate directly affected the quality of her milk. The nursery itself was a specific architectural space within the castle, usually located on an upper floor, away from the noise and draughts of the great hall, heated more consistently than other rooms because infants were understood to be particularly vulnerable to cold. The wet nurse spent most of her waking hours in or near this space. She slept close to the infant, sometimes in the same room, sometimes in an adjoining chamber, so that she could respond to the child's hunger at any hour of the night. The rhythm of her days was governed by the infant's needs, which in the early months meant feeding every few hours around the clock. Medieval physicians recommended a specific schedule of feeding times, typically 6 to 8 times per day, though in practice the schedule was adjusted to the individual child's temperament and the nurse's capacity. The feeding itself was a formal act, more ritualized than we might expect. In the most elevated households, the wet nurse did not simply put the child to breast whenever it cried. There were protocols. The nurse was expected to be in a calm state before feeding. She should not have recently been angry, or frightened, or physically exhausted, because these states were believed to affect the milk. She might say a prayer before nursing, not as an empty formality, but as a genuine attempt to compose her mind and body, to bring herself to the right spiritual and humoral condition for the act of feeding a child who was, after all, of royal blood. The food she was given was deliberately chosen to support milk production and to ensure the quality of the milk. She received more meat than ordinary servants. Beef and mutton were considered particularly beneficial to milk production because meat was understood as a rich and substantial food that would produce rich and substantial milk. She received bread of the better sort, not the coarse dark bread given to lower servants, but the white bread that was associated with prosperity and with a lighter, more digestible nourishment. She received ale, not water, because water was rightly suspected of being impure, and because moderate ale was thought to be beneficial to the digestion and hence to the milk. Wine might be given in small amounts. Fresh vegetables and fruits were part of her diet, though these were understood as supplementary rather than central. Certain foods were specifically prohibited, garlic and onion, because they gave the milk a sharp taste that the infant might reject. Strongly spiced foods for similar reasons. Anything considered too heating or too cooling in its humoral properties. The nurse's diet was, in practice, more carefully regulated than that of almost any other person in the castle, because her body was understood as a production facility for a substance of extraordinary importance. Her clothing was provided by the household, and the garments she received were of better quality than those given to ordinary domestic servants, though they were not the fine cloth and embroidery of the ladies of the court. She was typically given linen shift, wool gowns in practical colours, a good cloak for moving about the castle in cold months, and leather shoes. The quality of these garments was a reflection of her status, above the servants, below the ladies, and this ambiguous positioning was visible in everything about her life in the castle, from where she sat at meals to how she was dressed by the other members of the household. She was not called by her first name alone as a servant would be. She was typically called by a title that acknowledged her role, nurse or dame or goodwife, followed by her surname. She was dressed with a degree of respect that was partly genuine. The household understood that its most important current project, the survival and flourishing of the royal infant, depended on her, and partly formal, a social performance that maintained the distinctions of rank, even while temporarily elevating her. Her relationship with the Queen, or the great lady whose child she nursed, was one of the more complex social dynamics in the medieval castle. The mother had in most cases very little to do with the daily care of the infant during the nursing period. This was not entirely a matter of choice, though it was strongly shaped by convention and by the advice of physicians. The medical literature was consistent in its view that a mother's milk was not suitable for her own child, not because there was anything wrong with the mother, but because the emotional bond between mother and child was considered to make the milk too rich, too stimulating, too freighted with the mother's own anxieties and desires. A more objective woman, one who cared for the child without being blinded by maternal feeling, would produce a steadier, more reliable, more temperamentally balanced milk. This reasoning strikes us now as obviously wrong, and yet it had a kind of internal logic that made sense within the framework of humoral medicine, and it was repeated and elaborated by learned men for centuries. The Queen then occupied a peculiar position in relation to the wet nurse. She had handed over the most intimate possible act of maternal care to another woman, not because she was forced to in any simple sense, but because the entire weight of medical authority, social convention, and dynastic expectation pressed her in that direction. She might visit the nursery, she might hold her infant, she would certainly be kept informed of the child's progress. But the daily-hourly relationship, the one established through the repeated physical intimacy of nursing, was between the wet nurse and the child. This could produce feelings that the historical record only occasionally lets us glimpse: jealousy, gratitude, unease, affection, a complex tangle of emotions that had no clean name in the medieval vocabulary. There are cases in the historical record where queens formed lasting relationships with their children's wet nurses, where the nurse was retained in the household long after the child was weaned, given a permanent position, treated with conspicuous generosity. There are other cases where the nurse was paid and dismissed with no particular ceremony, her role completed, her person no longer of interest. And there are cases, rarer and more poignant, where the records hint at tension or conflict between the Queen and the nurse, where the nurse was dismissed early, or where complaints were lodged against her, though the nature of these complaints is rarely specified in terms that allow us to understand exactly what had gone wrong. The ladies-in-waiting occupied a middle position in all of this. They were the women who actually managed the nursery on a day-to-day basis, who supervised the wet nurse, who carried the infant from the nurse to the mother when visits were arranged, who maintained the protocols of the nursery and reported to the household officials on the infant's condition. They were typically women of gentle birth, daughters of minor nobility or of prosperous gentry families, who had been placed in the royal or great household as part of their own social education. They were above the wet nurse in social standing, and they sometimes made this clear in ways that were unkind. The nurse, after all, was a woman of the middling sort who'd been admitted to a great house, not for her birth or her connections, but for her body's capacity to produce milk. She was there as a kind of necessary instrument, and the ladies of the court, who were there for reasons of birth and patronage and complex social calculation, didn't always treat the instrument with the respect that her household title implied. This social friction was a quiet constant of the nursery environment. The wet nurse was dependent on the goodwill of the ladies for her comfort and her standing. She could not complain directly to the Queen or to the great lord. Her grievances, if she had them, had to be expressed indirectly, and if she was wise, she expressed them very little. She learned to move through the castle with the particular kind of tact that comes from understanding exactly where you stand in a hierarchy that was not of your making and that you cannot change, only navigate. The castle itself was her world for the duration of her service, which typically lasted until the child was weaned, usually sometime between the ages of 1 and 3, with 2 years being a common target in the medical literature. The castle was not a simple or monolithic space. It was a complex environment of corridors and courtyards and staircases and galleries and rooms of varying function and varying access. The nursery was one of the more restricted spaces, Not everyone could simply walk in, and the nurse was among the most constant presences within it. But she moved through the castle beyond the nursery as well, to the kitchen to supervise the preparation of her own special foods, to the chapel for the daily offices that were a normal part of castle life, to the great hall for meals, to the courtyard for the air and exercise that were recommended for her health, and hence for the quality of her milk. In these movements, she encountered the full social world of the medieval castle. The steward who managed the household accounts, the chaplain who conducted the religious life of the household, the cook and his army of subordinates in the great kitchen with its multiple hearths and its perpetual noise and smell, the grooms who maintained the stables, the laundresses who washed the castle's linen in great wooden tubs, the seamstresses who mended and made garments, the doorkeepers who controlled who entered and exited the various parts of the building, and the constant traffic of messengers and visitors and merchants and officials that passed through the gates of any active noble household. She was known to all of them, and she occupied in their shared mental map of the household a position that was unique to her role, simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, physically present in the most intimate spaces of the house, and yet socially anomalous, a woman whose body was, for the time being, more important to the dynastic enterprise than almost any other body in the building. The question of her own children, the children she had left behind or whose care she had handed to others, was a weight that the historical record cannot fully measure. We know from the accounts of later periods, when wet nursing practices were more extensively documented, that many nurses experienced acute anxiety about their own infants. Letters survive from the 17th and 18th centuries in which nurses beg their employers for permission to go home and check on their children, or in which family members write nurses with the news of a sick child at home. For the medieval period, such letters rarely survive, partly because many nurses were not literate and their communications were oral rather than written, and partly because the letters that were written were not considered important enough to preserve. But the anxiety itself, the knowledge that one's own child was being fed by another woman, or by animal milk, or by the thin gruel of pap, the knowledge that the wages one was earning came at the direct expense of one's own infant's nutritional security. This was a constant undercurrent of the wet nurse's life that the official record tends to paper over with the clean language of wages and contracts and household protocol. The contracts themselves are among the most interesting surviving documents related to wet nursing because they make explicit what was normally left unspoken: the precise terms of the exchange of a woman's bodily labour for money. These contracts, which become more common in the documentary record from the 13th and 14th centuries onward, specified the duration of service, the wages to be paid, the conditions under which the arrangement could be terminated early, and sometimes the specific obligations of both parties in considerable detail. The employer, whether a royal household or a wealthy merchant family, agreed to provide food, lodging, and clothing of specified quality. The nurse agreed to abstain from sexual intercourse for the duration of her service, to avoid specified foods and behaviours that might harm the milk, to give the child her full attention, and to nurse no other infant during her service, and sometimes to agree to specific penalties if she violated these terms. The prohibition on nursing other infants was significant. The wet nurse's milk was a scarce and valuable resource, and the employer wanted to be certain that it was not being shared. There were nurses in the medieval and early modern period who took on more than one nursling, sometimes openly, sometimes secretly, and if this was discovered, it was treated as a serious breach of contract, not merely because it divided the milk supply, but because it divided the nurse's attention and, in the medical thinking of the time, could introduce dangerous qualities to the milk by mixing the humoral influences of different infants on the nurse's body. The payment structure of these contracts reveals something important about how the profession was valued. A royal wet nurse in England in the late medieval period earned wages that placed her clearly above the level of domestic servants, and roughly equivalent to or above the wages of a skilled male craftsman. In France, where the documentation is somewhat richer, we can trace wage rates for royal wet nurses across several centuries and see that the wages were consistently high by the standards of the time, supplemented by gifts at Christmas and Easter and at the time of weaning, and sometimes by additional payments for specific services or in recognition of particularly good care. The nurse who successfully raised a healthy royal child was rewarded in ways that went beyond the formal contract. She might be given a lump sum payment at the end of her service, a bolt of fine cloth, a piece of jewellery, a grant of land in some cases, or a formal letter of recommendation that acknowledged her service to the royal household and could be shown to future employers. These material rewards were the visible face of a transaction that was also, always, profoundly intimate. The wet nurse and the royal infant spent more time in direct physical contact during the first year of the child's life than any other two people in the castle. She held him while he fed, and he was held by her for hours each day. She felt the weight of him against her body, the pull of his mouth, the small curling of his fingers around her own. She heard his first sounds become something approaching words. She was present when he first smiled, first reached toward her face, first recognized her voice in a room of many voices. Whatever the medical theory said about the advisability of keeping emotional distance between nurse and child, the emotional reality of this relationship was not so easily managed. There is a term that appears occasionally in the medieval sources, milk kinship, or in Latin fraternitas lactis. The idea was that two people who had been nursed by the same woman were in some sense siblings, bound by a tie that, while not biological in the modern sense, was understood as having a real and morally significant character. This idea was taken seriously enough that in some legal contexts, marriage between milk siblings was discouraged or prohibited. It reflected the deeper belief that nursing created a genuine bond, a bond of substance that is not merely sentimental but physically real. The nurse who had fed a royal infant had, according to this understanding, become something to that infant. Not a mother exactly, but a figure whose relationship to the child was grounded in the most fundamental physical intimacy, in the exchange of the substance of life itself. The child, for his part, knew the nurse before he knew the queen. He recognized her smell and her voice before he could distinguish faces with any clarity. If medieval descriptions of infant behaviour are to be trusted, and they are often stylized and formulaic, but not entirely without observational content, royal infants sometimes showed a marked preference for the nurse over the mother, at least in early infancy, which created social situations of considerable awkwardness. The queen who held out her arms to her child and found him reaching back for the nurse was experiencing something that the medical theory of the time had, perhaps deliberately, failed to fully anticipate. The question of what the nurse felt, what she herself experienced in this prolonged and intimate relationship with another woman's child, is one that the historical record addresses only obliquely. The accounts and contracts speak of her from the outside, in terms of what she was paid and what she was required to do. The occasional letter or deposition that gives us a glimpse of a nurse's own voice tends to be formal and constrained, written or dictated in a legal or administrative context that did not encourage emotional expression. And yet, there are traces. A nurse who petitioned for an additional payment at the end of her service, and described her attachment to the child she'd raised with language that went beyond the professional. A household account that noted, without further explanation, that the nurse wept when she was dismissed. A chronicle entry that recorded, almost as an aside, that when a royal prince fell ill, the nurse who had nursed him as an infant, long since dismissed from service, came to the castle of her own accord to offer whatever help she could. These traces matter. They suggest that the emotional labour of the wet nurse's position was not merely a side effect of the work, but a central part of it, a dimension that the official record undervalued, because the official record was written by and for people who valued women's emotional labour least, when it was performed by women of the middling sort. Consider the winter months inside the castle. The stone walls, which provided such excellent insulation against summer heat, became cold in winter in a way that modern centrally heated buildings cannot quite replicate. A cold that entered from the outside through the walls themselves. A damp cold at the hearth in the nursery could mitigate but not entirely defeat. The nurse spent these months in rooms that were, by modern standards, dim and cold and noisy with the sounds of the castle's life, the footsteps of servants in the corridors, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the wind against the shuttered windows, the low sounds of animals in the courtyard below. The nursery fire was kept burning almost continuously through the winter months, and the nurse's primary task during the coldest periods was often simply to keep the infant warm, holding him against her body, wrapping him in the layers of woolen cloth and fur-trimmed blankets that wealthy households provided for their youngest members. The nursery's furnishings in a great household were more elaborate than those of most other rooms in the castle. The infant's cradle was typically made of good wood, shaped to allow gentle rocking, and might be decorated with carvings or hung with curtains to protect the sleeping child from draughts. There was chair or stool for the nurse, positioned near the cradle and near the fire. There might be a small table for the vessels and cloths needed for the infant's care. The room would have its own chamber pot, its own supply of clean water, its own small store of the special foods and herbal preparations that were kept on hand for the infant's care. The smells of the nursery were a mixture of the fire, the clean linen that was changed frequently, the particular warm smell of an infant's body, and the herbs, lavender, rosemary, chamomile, that were strewn among the linens and sometimes burned in small censers to purify the air. Medieval physicians were emphatic about air quality in the nursery. Corrupt air, air that was damp, stagnant, or contaminated by proximity to drains or to the effluvia of sick bodies, was held responsible for a significant proportion of infant mortality. They were not entirely wrong in this intuition, even if their theoretical explanation was different from the germ theory of disease. The nurse was responsible for ensuring that the nursery windows were opened at appropriate times to allow the circulation of fresh air, while being careful not to expose the infant to draughts or to the cold air of early morning. She was expected to monitor the fire, to ensure that the room was neither too hot nor too cold, and to recognise the signs that the infant's temperature was not properly regulated. This was practical knowledge of a specific and learned kind, and nurses who were experienced in their profession carried it as a genuine expertise. The nurses' nights were broken. This is a fact that the historical record mentions in passing in the specifications of her duties, but does not dwell on. Infants, in every era of human history, wake in the night and need to be fed, and the wet nurse who slept near the royal nursery woke with them, took the infant from the cradle, nursed him in the firelit dark, rocked him back to sleep, and lay down again for whatever hours of rest remained before the castle began its morning routines. Sleep deprivation was a constant feature of the nurse's life during the early months of her service, though the household records, which were written in the daytime by men who slept through the night in their own beds, rarely acknowledged this. The nurse was expected to be cheerful and calm in her demeanour, steady and reliable in her work, capable of responding to the infant's needs at any hour, and yet the physiological reality of nursing a young infant around the clock was that she was operating for weeks and sometimes months at a time on consistently interrupted sleep. That she did this competently, in an environment that was demanding in every other respect as well, suggests a kind of physical and psychological resilience that deserves more acknowledgement than it has typically received. The seasonal rhythms of the castle affected the nurse's life in specific ways. Summer brought its own challenges. The heat in the castle's upper rooms, where the nursery were typically located, the flies that were difficult to exclude, the increased risk of the intestinal illnesses that were more prevalent in warm weather. The nurse was expected to be particularly vigilant in summer about the infant's diet, about the quality of her own food, which might spoil more quickly in the heat, and about the cleanliness of everything that touched the infant's body. Medieval physicians wrote extensively about the risks of summer to infants, and the nurse who had experience with these seasons knew that the months from June through August demanded a heightened attention, a different kind of watchfulness than the other seasons of the year. Spring brought the castle to life in a way that affected the nurse as it affected everyone. The reopening of the windows, the return of colour to the courtyard, the resumption of outdoor activities that had been curtailed by winter. The physician's recommendation of fresh air and gentle outdoor exercise for the nursing infant meant that the nurse now took her charge outside, into the castle's garden or courtyard, in the milder hours of the day. These excursions were formal in their way, accompanied by ladies-in-waiting, conducted at specific times and for specific durations, but they offered the nurse a change of scene and so quality of light that the dim nursery could not provide. She saw the garden in all its seasons and developed, inevitably, a kind of proprietary relationship to the spaces of the castle that were part of her daily circuit. Autumn was the season of weaning in many households, or at least the season when weaning was most commonly discussed. The process of weaning was itself a complex medical and social operation that medieval physicians addressed in considerable detail. The standard approach involved a gradual reduction of nursing, combined with the introduction of supplementary foods over a period of weeks or months. The foods introduced during weaning were carefully chosen: soft bread soaked in milk or broth, cooked vegetables of the most digestible kinds, tender meat finely minced, sweet fruits in season. The abrupt cessation of nursing was generally discouraged, because the sudden loss of the breast was thought to cause the infant distress and possibly illness, but also because the abrupt drying up of the nurse's milk could cause her physical discomfort and was thought to be unhealthy for her as well. The emotional dimensions of weaning were addressed in some of the more thoughtful medical texts, though always from the perspective of the infant's welfare rather than the nurse's feelings. The infant who had known the nurse as his primary source of comfort and nourishment would, upon weaning, lose both the physical intimacy of nursing and usually the nurse herself, since her purpose in the household ended when the child no longer needed her milk. This loss, the loss of the warm, familiar body, the familiar voice and smell, the particular comfort that she had provided, was understood by medieval physicians as a genuine disruption in the child's experience, one that needed to be managed with care and gentleness. The gradual approach to weaning was partly motivated by this concern. If the transition was slow enough, the child would adjust to each small change before the next was introduced, and by the time the nurse finally departed, the child would already have established other sources of comfort and nourishment. What the medical text did not fully acknowledge was that the nurse herself was undergoing a loss at the same time. The physical process of having her milk dry up, which happened naturally over the weeks following the cessation of nursing, was uncomfortable at first, involving engorgement and tenderness, before the body gradually reduced its production. But beyond the physical, the nurse was losing the relationship that had, for a year or two, organised her entire life. She had risen and slept and eaten and moved through the castle in response to this child's needs. She had held him for hours each day. She had felt his weight against her body change over the months as he grew, had watched the gradual transformation from the near helpless newborn to the curious, mobile, increasingly interactive creature of 1 and 2 years old. Whatever the theory said about emotional distance, the reality was that she knew this child in a way that almost no one else did, not from the perspective of power or ambition or dynastic calculation, but from the most intimate physical proximity, from the daily administration of care that was the foundation of his survival. When she departed, she was given her final payment, her parting gifts, perhaps a formal letter acknowledging her service, and she went back to a world that had continued without her. A husband who had lived separately from her for years, children of her own who had grown and changed in her absence, a community that knew she had served in a great house, but could not fully imagine what that had been like. The transition back to ordinary life, to the smaller rooms of a craftsman's house, to the less regulated meals, to the absence of the castle's elaborate social structure, was a transition that the historical record does not track. The nurse disappears from the household accounts on the day of her dismissal, and what her life looked like afterward is, in most cases, entirely unknown to us. There were exceptions. The most famous wet nurses in medieval history were those who remained connected to the children they had raised, who were retained in the household, who were given ongoing pensions or properties, or whose names were recorded because the children they had raised became historically significant. Among the most documented examples in the English record are the nurses of several Plantagenet princes, whose names appear in the patent rolls and in household accounts, because the princes themselves, when they came to power, sometimes acknowledged their nurses with formal grants or gifts. Edward IV of England is recorded as having shown particular warmth toward his nurse, and there are similar examples from the French royal line, where the nurse of a Valois prince might appear in the royal accounts for decades after the period of nursing itself had ended, receiving periodic gifts and pensions. In France, the institution of wet nursing was perhaps more extensively documented than anywhere else in medieval Europe, partly because the French royal household kept more systematic records, and partly because the practice continued with remarkable continuity well into the early modern period and even beyond. The nurses of French princes bore a specific title, the nourrice, and occupied a defined role in the household hierarchy that, while never elevating them to the level of the nobility, gave them a recognized and respected position. Some of these women became known figures in the history of the families they served. The nourrice, who had raised a prince who became a great king, was a person whose claim on the household's gratitude was not entirely without weight, and in a culture that placed great importance on bonds of personal loyalty and personal obligation, this claim was sometimes honoured. The Byzantine world offers a different but equally interesting set of examples. The imperial wet nurse in Constantinople occupied a role that was in some ways more formally defined than her Western counterpart, partly because the Byzantine court was more elaborately bureaucratized, and partly because the Eastern medical tradition, drawing on both Greek and Arabic sources, had developed an even more explicit theory of the milk's role in transmitting character. Byzantine chronicles record several nurses of imperial children by name, and in a few cases we have descriptions of these women that go beyond their physical qualifications. We hear of a nurse who was known for her intelligence and her equanimity, of another who was said to have had such a calming presence that the emperor himself, in his adult years, occasionally sought her company when he was troubled. These anecdotes may be conventionalized. Byzantine historical writing had its own formulas, but they suggest that the memory of the relationship between nurse and child could persist across the decades that separated nursing from adulthood, and that this persistence was understood as having a genuine significance. In the Islamic world, which influenced Western medical thinking through the translations of the 12th century, the role of the wet nurse was also extensively theorized, drawing on both Greek medical tradition and on the specific guidance of Islamic jurisprudence. The Quran and the Hadith addressed the question of nursing directly, and Islamic law developed a detailed treatment of the rights and obligations of wet nurses that had no precise equivalent in Western canon law. Under Islamic jurisprudence, milk kinship had legal consequences. A man could not marry his milk sister, and there were detailed rules about how many feedings were required to establish the milk kinship relationship. The nurse was entitled to compensation for her services, and the texts of Islamic jurisprudence that dealt with wet nursing showed a more explicit recognition of the nurse's perspective, her rights, her entitlements, her claim to be treated with fairness, than most of the Western sources. The crossover between these traditions, mediated by the medical school of Salerno and by the extensive translation movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, meant that physicians practicing in the great households of Western Europe were drawing on a synthesis of Greek, Arabic, and indigenous European ideas when they advised on the selection and management of wet nurses. This synthesis was not always internally consistent. Different texts recommended different things about the ideal nurse's age, her diet, her humoral constitution, and the physicians who applied these recommendations in practice had to exercise a kind of practical judgment that the texts themselves did not always supply. The nurse, for her part, often knew more about the practical management of infants than the physicians who examined her, and there are occasional hints in their records of a productive tension between the learned man's theory and the experienced woman's knowledge, a tension that is rarely acknowledged openly, because the social hierarchy of the medieval world did not typically encourage learned men to defer to the practical wisdom of women of the middling sort. The smell of the castle's kitchen was something the nurse knew well, because her diet was managed through the kitchen, and because she sometimes went there personally to oversee the preparation of the special foods that her own diet required, or that were being prepared for the infant's weaning. The great kitchen of a medieval castle was one of the most intensely sensory spaces in the building. Hot even in winter, loud with the voices of cooks and their assistants, fragrant with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread, and the herbs that were used in cooking, smoky from the multiple hearths that burned almost continuously. It was also a space of considerable social complexity, with its own internal hierarchy, the master cook at the apex, the various sous cooks and roasters and pastry makers and spit turners arranged below him, and its own codes of behaviour and precedence. The nurse's visits to the kitchen were brief and purposeful, but they connected her, however tangentially, to the vast operation of feeding that was the castle's most constant and most essential daily work. The chapel was another space in the nurse's circuit. Castle chapels ranged from small private oratories to substantial buildings capable of accommodating the entire household, and the daily offices, the canonical hours of prayer that mark the medieval day, were a standard feature of household life at all social levels. The nurse attended Mass, as everyone in the household was expected to do, and the chapel was one of the few spaces where the social hierarchies of the castle were at least formally suspended in the common act of worship. The nurse knelt beside ladies of the court, behind the family itself, in a spatial arrangement that reflected the household's order, but that placed everyone ultimately in the same relationship to the sacred. Her prayers included almost certainly prayers for the infant in her care, and for her own children at home, prayers that were private and unrecorded, but that were as much a part of her daily routine as the feeding and the rocking and the watching through the night. The castle's religious life intersected with the nurse's professional life in specific ways. The baptism of the royal infant, which typically took place within days of birth, was an event from which the nurse was generally excluded or present only in a procural capacity. It was a ceremony of the church and the nobility, managed by the chaplain and the godparents in the family. But the ongoing religious education of the infant, which began earlier than we might expect, was something that the nurse participated in directly. She was expected to make the sign of the cross over the child regularly, to say simple prayers in his hearing, to ensure that the religious objects appropriate to the nursery, small crosses, images of the Virgin, blessed candles, were maintained in their proper place. The first religious impressions of a royal child were received in the nursery, in the company of the nurse, and the women who were responsible for this environment understood themselves as contributing to a formation that was spiritual as well as physical. The question of the nurse's own spiritual life, her relationship to the church, her observance of fast days and feast days, her participation in the sacraments, intersected in interesting ways with the practical demands of her profession. Fast days were particularly complicated for a wet nurse, because the reduction of food intake that fasting required was thought to reduce the quantity and quality of milk. Some medical writers argued explicitly that wet nurses should be excused from strict fasting, at least during the most demanding period of the infant's nursing, because the welfare of the child depended on the nurse's adequate nutrition. Whether this exemption was granted in practice depended on the specific household and the specific confessor, and the nurse who wished to fast for spiritual reasons might find herself in tension with the physician who had prescribed a diet, a tension that placed the nurse's own religious agency in conflict with the authority structures that governed her professional life. There were also the more ordinary religious observances, the feast days of the saints, the celebrations of Christmas and Easter, the special masses and processions that mark the ecclesiastical calendar, during which the castle's routine was altered and the nurse's situation shifted. On great feast days, the household gathered in the great hall for meals of unusual elaborateness, and the nurse had a specific place in this gathering that reflected her status. She sat, typically, at a table that was neither the high table of the family nor the lower tables of the household servants, but at an intermediate place that acknowledged both her importance and her ambiguous social position. The food served at these meals was richer than ordinary, and the nurse was expected to eat with the moderation that her professional responsibilities required, present at the feast, but not quite of it. The Christmas season in particular was a time when gifts were exchanged in a relatively formalised way throughout the medieval household. The wet nurse received Christmas gifts from the family she served, gifts whose nature and value reflected her importance and the family's gratitude. A good woolen gown, a pair of fine gloves, a piece of embroidered cloth, sometimes a small amount of money in addition to her wages. These were the kinds of gifts that appear in the household accounts under the heading of Christmas gifts to household members. They were given partly out of genuine appreciation and partly as a form of social management, maintaining the nurse's goodwill and her commitment to her work at a time of the year when the cold and the distance from her own family might make her particularly aware of what she had sacrificed in taking on the position. The long evenings of winter, when darkness came early and the castle's life contracted around its fires, were times when the nursery became its own small world. The nurse, the infant, perhaps a servant girl who assisted with the more basic tasks of laundry and cleaning, and occasionally a lady-in-waiting who kept the nurse company. These were the inhabitants of the nursery in the evening hours. The medieval evening was not spent in silence. There was talk, there were simple songs, there were the particular vocalizations that adults addressed to infants in every culture and every era. These sounds that encourage response and they begin the long process of language acquisition. The nurse sang to the child. This is recorded in several sources, sometimes with details about the kinds of songs. Lullabies, simple religious songs, nursery rhymes in the vernacular language of the region. The lullabies that were sung to royal infants in the medieval period were not entirely different from those sung by the poorest mothers in the countryside. They were addressed to sleep. They invoked protection. They used the particular rhythms that had been found over centuries of human experience to calm an infant and encourage drowsiness. The nurse's voice in these evening hours was the dominant sound of the nursery. Her voice reading or reciting prayers, her voice singing, her voice speaking to the infant in the low, unhurried tones that she had learned to use in this space. These sounds became the sonic environment of the royal infant's early life. When that infant grew up and became a king or a great lord, he would not remember the specific words or melodies. Memory of that quality does not persist from infancy. But the research of a much later era has suggested that early acoustic experience leaves traces that are not accessible to conscious recall, that nonetheless shape the emotional and psychological landscape of the developing person in ways that are real, if difficult to measure. The nurse's voice, in other words, may have mattered in ways that neither she nor her contemporaries could have fully articulated. The question of what happened when the nurse fell ill raises one of the more practically urgent aspects of the profession. Illness was a constant of medieval life, and the castle was not exempt from the epidemic diseases that swept through populations periodically, nor from the more ordinary seasonal illnesses that affected everyone. A wet nurse fell ill presented an immediate crisis, because the infant's feeding could not simply be paused. If the nurse's illness was minor and brief, the infant might be fed by another woman who happened to be nursing at the time, sometimes another servant in the household. sometimes a woman brought in from the surrounding community. This substitute arrangement was always understood as temporary and was regarded with some anxiety, because the substitute had not undergone the examination and selection that the primary nurse had, and her milk was of unknown quality in both the physical and the moral sense. If the nurse's illness was more serious, if she had a fever or a condition that affected her milk supply, or one of the infectious diseases that the medieval world feared most, the situation was genuinely alarming. The household would immediately begin the process of finding a replacement nurse, a process that could take days or even weeks, during which the infant was fed by whatever improvised means were available. The anxiety that surrounded these periods of transition is palpable in the household records that preserve them, and it is a measure of how complete the infant's welfare had been organised around a single woman's body. When that body became unavailable, there was no simple backup, no alternative system already in place. The nurse's death, which was relatively uncommon but not unheard of, posed a more severe version of the same crisis, requiring a rapid and complete replacement of the entire nursing relationship at a time when the infant had already formed a strong attachment to the original nurse. In these circumstances, the household was required to move quickly. Messengers were sent to the families of known candidates, women who had recently given birth and whose families had some connection to the household. Physicians were consulted. The examination and selection process that had taken weeks when the original nurse was chosen was compressed into days or hours, and the replacement nurse who emerged from this rapid selection was typically accepted on a more provisional basis, with greater ongoing scrutiny, until it became clear that the infant was thriving on her milk. The infant's response, his willingness to nurse, his absence of illness, his general contentment, was itself taken as evidence of the milk's suitability, a kind of ongoing empirical test that supplemented the physician's formal assessment. The mortality of royal infants was high by modern standards, and when an infant died, the household was plunged into grief, and the wet nurse found herself in a peculiar position. She had done her work. She had fed and cared for this child, and yet the child had died of one of the many causes that carried off infants in the medieval world. The sweating sickness, the summer flux, a respiratory infection that could not be fought, the simple and terrible fragility of newborn life in a world without vaccines or antibiotics or any of the interventions that modern medicine takes for granted. The nurse was not blamed for the death unless there was specific evidence of negligence or misconduct, but she was nonetheless associated with it in the minds of the bereaved family, and the household that had been organised around the infant's care was now a household in mourning, and the nurse's presence within it was suddenly without purpose. She was typically dismissed quickly in these circumstances, given her final payment, and sent home. The grief she may have felt for the child she had nursed, a grief that was real and that she had no sanctioned language for expressing, was carried away with her into a private life that the records do not follow. The broader social meaning of the wet nurse's profession in medieval society illuminates something important about how that society understood the relationship between women's bodies, women's labour, and the social order. The wet nurse was a woman whose body had been temporarily recruited into the service of a great family's most fundamental interest, the survival and flourishing of its children. She was compensated for this service, and in material terms she was often compensated very well. But the compensation was for a form of labour that was understood as natural to women, as something that women simply did with their bodies, and this understanding tended to obscure the skilled and demanding nature of the work itself. The knowledge that an experienced nurse brought to her position, her understanding of infant behaviour, her ability to manage the complex environment of the nursery, her physical capacity to produce adequate milk over months or years, was the product of experience and of practical wisdom that was not formalized in any curriculum or recognized in any credential, and so it was consistently undervalued in the official accounting of what made a good nurse. This undervaluation was not unique to wet nursing. It was a general feature of how medieval society thought about women's domestic and reproductive labour. The skills involved in managing a household, in preparing food, in caring for the sick and the young, in the enormous enterprise of cloth-making that occupied a large proportion of women's working time, all of these were understood as natural extensions of feminine capacity, and as such they were less visible as labour than the work performed by men in the fields, the workshops, and the administrative offices of the medieval world. The wet nurse who was paid well because the stakes were unusually high, because the infant she was feeding was of royal or noble blood, and because the family's need was urgent and specific. But the knowledge and skill she brought to her work were not, in principle, different from the knowledge and skill brought by the women who fed and cared for the children of lesser families, and those women were not paid at all. They were simply doing what women did. There is a kind of historical tragedy in this, if tragedy is not too grand a word for a structural reality that was simply the water in which medieval people swam. The wet nurse was, for a brief period, recognized and rewarded for her labour in a way that most women who performed similar labour were not. The contingency that elevated her, the accident of whose child she happened to be feeding, makes visible the arbitrariness of a social system that valued the same physical and practical capacity very differently, depending on the social rank of the person being served. This arbitrariness was not a secret. It was, in various ways, noted and commented upon by medieval writers, including writers who were, in principle, advocates of a more equitable order, but noting the arbitrariness of a system and changing it are very different things, and the medieval world, like most worlds, was better at the first than the second. What we are left with at the end of this inquiry is a figure who is specific and human and largely forgotten. She was a woman who gave her milk to a royal child and was paid for doing so, and who went home at the end of her service to a life that the records do not follow. She carried with her the physical changes that nursing had made to her body, the memories of a child she had watched grow, the wages she had saved, and the gifts she had been given, and whatever private knowledge she had accumulated about the interior life of a great castle and the people who lived within it. She knew things that no one else knew, or knew in quite the same way. The sounds the infant made when he was hungry and when he was satisfied, the smell of the nursery in winter and in summer, the particular quality of the firelight in the early morning hours when she nursed the sleeping household's most important occupant while the rest of the castle still slept. She knew these things, and she knew that she knew them, and then she grew old and died, as everyone does, and the specific texture of her knowledge dissolved with her. What remains is the outline, the wages in the accounts, the name in the contract, the brief mention in the chronicle. From this outline we can reconstruct something of a life, something of what it was to be a particular kind of woman in a particular kind of place at a particular moment in the long history of the world. It is not a complete reconstruction, and it cannot be, but the attempt to make it is itself a form of recognition, a small gesture against the forgetting that has swallowed her whole. She fed a king. She woke in the night to do it, and she was cold sometimes, and tired sometimes, and worried about her children at home. She received good linen in payment and perhaps a piece of silver, and she wore the linen out and spent the silver, and the children she worried about grew up and had children of their own, and those children are now, if they are anywhere, atoms dispersed in the long, still air. The king she fed grew up and fought battles and signed charters, and was commemorated in stone and class and the elaborate machinery of historical memory. His nurse is a line in an account book, if she is anything at all. This is how it was. And knowing how it was, being willing to sit quietly with a knowledge of how it was, without flinching from the strangeness of it, is perhaps the closest we can come to the kind of history that does justice to everyone who lived, not only to those whose names were written in stone. The nursery fire burned down in the early hours, and the nurse banked it carefully, and the infant slept, and the castle was quiet around them both. Outside the shuttered window the night held its usual depth and darkness. The stars clear above the walls, the countryside lying still under whatever season it was, cold and bare, or warm and green, or somewhere in the long middle of the year. She had fed him, and he was sleeping. Tomorrow she would do it again, and the day after that, until the day came when she was no longer needed, and the castle's gates closed behind her, and she walked back into the ordinary world, carrying everything she knew. We have not yet spoken, in any real detail, about the way medieval medicine thought about the relationship between the nurse's emotional state and the quality of her milk. This relationship was not merely assumed, but extensively theorized, and it shaped the daily management of the nurse's life in the castle in ways that were both reasonable and, from our perspective, sometimes strange. The great medical writers whose works formed the foundation of European medical education, Galen, Avicenna, and their medieval interpreters, were united in the view that the passions of the soul acted directly on the body, altering the composition of the blood and hence of all the substances that blood produced. Grief, they held, could make the blood thick and cold, reducing the production of milk or rendering it dark and heavy. Fear could make the blood thin and agitated, producing milk that was watery and lacking in nourishment. Anger was particularly dangerous. A nurse who nursed while angry was believed to be transmitting the physical correlates of your anger, the hot, disturbed blood, the elevated bile, directly to the infant through her milk. And several medieval medical texts reported cases of infants who had fallen into convulsions or fever after being nursed by an angry woman. We cannot verify these reports, and we have every reason to be sceptical of them as literal accounts of causation. But they served an important social function. They gave the household a medical rationale for managing the nurse's emotional life, for insisting on her equanimity, for protecting her from distressing news and distressing encounters, for ensuring that the environment in which she lived and worked was as calm and pleasant as the castle's resources could make it. Whether or not anger actually corrupted the milk, the belief that it did meant that the nurse's emotional welfare was, within the terms of medieval medicine, a matter of legitimate concern and practical importance. This is not a small thing. In a world that was generally indifferent to the emotional welfare of women of the middling orders, the wet nurse's feelings were attended to, not for her sake, but for the infant's sake, and not in terms that acknowledged her as a full subject of experience, but within a framework that nonetheless created real protections for her daily life. The household was therefore charged with keeping the nurse happy, or at least calm. She was not to be given news of deaths in her family unless absolutely necessary. She was not to be subjected to the rougher kinds of social friction that were a normal feature of life among castle servants. She was to be given the food she preferred, within the constraints of her prescribed diet. She was to have adequate sleep, adequate warmth, adequate time for the exercise and fresh air that the physicians recommended. If she asked for something reasonable, it was generally granted, not as courtesy but as a medical necessity. This placed her in a situation that was, materially, quite comfortable by the standards of her social class, and that gave her a degree of practical leverage over her daily conditions that ordinary servants did not possess. She could not ask for the impossible, but she could ask for the reasonable, and the reasonable was more often given to her than refused. This leverage was not without its complications. The nurse who understood her position clearly, and experienced nurses generally did understand it clearly, might use it skillfully to secure advantages that went beyond what was strictly necessary for the production of good milk. An extra allowance of cloth, a particularly desirable chamber assignment, a greater degree of freedom in her movements through the castle. These were things that a confident and articulate nurse might negotiate within the unspoken limits of what the household would accept. But a nurse who pushed too hard, who asked her too much, who made herself conspicuous as someone who was exploiting her temporary importance. This woman risked being seen as troublesome, and a troublesome nurse could be dismissed, even at some cost to the household, if the family decided that the inconvenience of replacing her was preferable to the ongoing irritation of managing her. The social intelligence required to navigate this situation, to secure one's legitimate needs and interests without overstepping the invisible boundaries of acceptable behaviour, was a form of practical wisdom that was highly developed in women who successfully completed multiple terms of service as wet nurses. Some women made a career of it. The records show nurses who served in 2, 3, or even 4 great households over the course of their fertile years, accumulating both the wages and the social connections that made them attractive to subsequent employers. And these experienced nurses were particularly sought after because they had demonstrated across multiple placements their physical capacity to produce adequate milk for extended periods, and their social capacity to manage the complex demands of the position without causing disruption. They were, in a sense, professionals in the modern sense of the word, women who had developed a specific expertise and who could offer it to successive employers on the basis of a demonstrated track record. For these experienced nurses, the world of the great household was familiar territory. They knew how to read the social dynamics of the nursery from the first days of their service, how to position themselves in relation to the ladies in waiting, how to manage the physician's visits, how to communicate their needs to the household steward without giving offence, how to maintain their standing in the household's informal social hierarchy. They knew, too, the physical realities of their profession in a way that a first-time nurse could not. The engorgement of the early weeks, the discomfort of nursing an infant who bit, the management of milk supply through diet and frequency of nursing, the recognition of the early signs of mastitis or other conditions that could interrupt their service. Mastitis, the infection of the breast tissue that can occur in nursing women, was a condition that medieval medicine described under various names and treated with a combination of herbal poultices, dietary modification, and in severe cases the lancing of abscesses. It was a relatively common complication of nursing, and for a wet nurse it represented a professional crisis because an infected breast could make nursing painful or possible, and if both breasts were affected, the nurse's ability to feed the infant was temporarily destroyed. Medieval medical texts described treatments for inflamed breasts that included poultices made of lily root, of linseed, of bread and milk applied warm to the skin, and of various herbal preparations whose active ingredients we can sometimes identify in retrospect as having genuine anti-inflammatory properties. The nurse was expected to report any signs of infection immediately, and the household physician would be called to assess the situation and prescribe treatment. The physician's role in the nursery was, in general, more involved than we might expect. Medieval physicians, those who served great households, visited the nursery regularly, not only when illness struck, but as a routine matter of monitoring the infant's development and the nurse's health. These visits were formal occasions structured by the protocols of medical practice that had evolved over centuries of learned tradition. The physician would examine the infant, assess his colour and his tone, and the quality of his nursing, ask the nurse about the frequency and character of his feeding, and his sleep and his elimination, and then examine the nurse herself, taking her pulse, assessing her complexion, asking about her diet and her sleep and the quality of her milk. His report to the household would be delivered to the senior officer responsible for the nursery, usually the mistress of the household or a designated lady of the chamber, and his recommendations would be implemented with the same authority that his other medical prescriptions carried. The relationship between the physician and the nurse was one of the few relationships in the castle in which a learned man of relatively high social standing was required to take seriously the knowledge and observations of a woman of the middling sort. The physician needed the nurse's observations. She was with the infant constantly, and her reports of his behaviour and her own physical condition were data that the physician could not obtain any other way. He might discount some of what she told him, might filter their observations through his theoretical framework in ways that distorted them, but he could not ignore her entirely without compromising his ability to do his job. This created a practical form of epistemic respect, however limited, that was unusual in the medieval social order, a context in which a woman's direct experience was treated as relevant, indeed necessary evidence. The herbs of the medieval pharmacopoeia played a significant role in the nurse's daily life. Fennel was commonly recommended as a galactagogue, a substance that promoted milk production, and was a standard element of the nurse's dietary supplements. Cumin and caraway were similarly prescribed. Fenugreek, though less commonly available in northern Europe, was known through the Arabic medical texts and was sometimes prescribed by physicians in great households that had access to the Mediterranean spice trade. The nurse might have a small personal supply of dried herbs recommended by the physician, kept in a cloth bag in her chamber, and she might use them to make infusions that were drunk in the course of her daily routine. She was also the administrator of the medicinal preparations given to the infant. The syrups and infusions prescribed for colic, the herbal washes used on the infant's skin, the preparations of various gentle substances that were placed in the infant's mouth before nursing, to clean it or to prepare it for the breast. The infant's crying was the constant background of the nursery, and the nurse's ability to interpret it was one of her most valued skills. Medieval writers on childcare described several distinct types of infant crying. Crying from hunger, from pain, from cold, from loneliness, from the distress of wet or soiled linens, and the experienced nurse was expected to be able to distinguish among them and respond appropriately. This was practical knowledge of the most intimate kind, built up through hours of close attention to a specific infant's behaviour patterns and signals. No two infants cried alike, and no two infants responded in the same way to the interventions. The nursing, the rocking, the walking, the singing that were the nurse's standard tools. Part of what the experienced nurse brought to her position was the ability to read these individual variations quickly, to establish a working understanding of a particular infant's communication system within days of beginning her service. The swaddling of the infant was another area in which the nurse's knowledge and skill were directly relevant to its welfare. The medieval practice of swaddling, wrapping the infant tightly in bands of cloth, was widely followed in the great households, and the reasons given for it were partly medical and partly practical. Medically, swaddling was believed to ensure the proper formation of the infant's limbs, which were understood as soft and plastic in early infancy, and liable to become crooked or deformed if not properly supported. Practically, a swaddled infant was easier to handle and transport, and the wrapping provided warmth in cold rooms. The nurse was responsible for swaddling and unswaddling the infant at the appropriate times, for ensuring that the bands were applied firmly but not so tightly as to impede circulation, and for the inspection of the infant's skin at each unswaddling for any signs of redness or irritation from the bindings. The technique of swaddling, how to wrap the bands efficiently and correctly, how to position the infant's arms and legs, how to secure the outer wrapping, was a practical skill that had to be learned and that varied somewhat in its specifics from one region to another and from one social class to another. The great households of medieval Europe were not static environments. They moved. The royal household, particularly, was almost perpetually mobile, travelling from one castle or palace to another in a circuit that was determined by a combination of political necessity, the management of the royal estates, the requirements of the royal hunt, and the simple practical need to allow the household to stay in each location long enough for the castle's privies and kitchens and courtyards to be cleaned before returning. This mobility had significant implications for the wet nurse, who had to travel with the household while also managing the demands of nursing an infant. Travel in the medieval period was slow, often uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous, particularly in winter, and an infant travelling with the household was exposed to cold, to irregular feeding schedules, and to the various risks of movement that did not apply in the stable environment of the castle. The nurse's role during these travels was to maintain as much of the nursery routine as possible under conditions that were significantly less controlled than those of the castle. In a covered cart or wagon, the preferred mode of transport for women and infants of high rank, she could nurse the infant during the journey. At stops along the way, she needed to establish temporary nursery conditions, a warm room, a fire, clean linens, the special foods that her diet required. The household officers responsible for advance arrangements would typically specify the nurse's requirements to the hosts at each overnight stop, and the hosts, who were themselves usually members of the nobility or gentry, with some experience of the demands of a travelling royal household, would attempt to provide what was needed. The quality of these temporary arrangements varied enormously, depending on the resources and the diligence of the host, and the nurse, who was experienced in travel, had learned to manage with whatever was available, while protecting the infant as effectively as possible. The great castle of the Middle Ages was also, of course, a place of political life, a site of alliances and negotiations and entertainments and ceremonies that were the visible expression of the social order. Tournaments, feasts, ambassadorial receptions, the gatherings of councils and courts of justice. These events filled the calendar of any active noble household with the density of formal activity that was the opposite of the nursery's quietude. The nurse moved through these events at the margins, witnessing them from the periphery of the social world that they constituted. She might be present in the great hall during a feast at her designated table, and observe the entertainments and the company without participating in them. She might pass through corridors during a tournament and hear the sounds of it without seeing the lists. She was a witness to the political life of the castle, in the way that the servants and the minor functionaries were witnesses to it, present enough to observe, excluded enough to be invisible to the main actors, and yet her position made her occasionally relevant to the political life of the castle. In ways that exceeded her nominal function, the infant she nursed was a political entity, the heir to a dynasty, the focus of dynastic calculations that extended across generations. His survival was a matter of political consequence, and those responsible for his survival were, during his earliest and most vulnerable years, principally the wet nurse and the women of the nursery. In times of dynastic crisis, when succession was contested, when the infant's legitimacy was challenged, when rivals threatened the family's position, the nurse was a person whose testimony about the infant's health, appearance, and development might be sought by those with interests in the political outcome. She was not a political actor in the normal sense, but her intimate knowledge of the heir's physical state and her proximity to the earliest years of his life gave her a kind of political relevance that those who managed the great events of the castle might occasionally need to draw upon. In the turbulent politics of medieval succession, the wet nurse occasionally appears in the historical record as witness to matters of considerable moment. The question of whether an infant had been stillborn or had survived, the question of whether the child presented to the court was truly the Queen's own child or a substitute, the question of whether a prince who had died in infancy had shown signs of the illness that killed him, or had appeared healthy. These were questions on which the nurse's evidence could be decisive, and in a few documented cases it was. The nurse who had been present at a contested birth or a disputed death was woman whose testimony was sought and whose words were taken seriously in a legal and political context that otherwise gave women of her social class very little formal standing. This occasional political visibility did not transform the nurse's structural position, but it is a reminder that the influence of the nursery was not entirely confined to the physical realm. The children who were raised in the care of wet nurses, who were, that is to say, virtually every child of the European nobility and royalty for a period of many centuries, carried into their adult lives the deep impressions of that early care. Medieval writers, drawing on the theory of milk's formative power, were convinced that this influence was direct and traceable. The man who was a cowardly or vicious or intellectually limited had, they sometimes suggested, drunk these qualities from his nurse's milk. Modern thinking does not accept this mechanism, but it does not entirely dismiss the more general claim that early care has lasting effects. The wet nurse who was calm and attentive, who sang and spoke and held and responded consistently, who provided the infant with the sensory richness and emotional security that the research of a much later era would identify as necessary for healthy development. This woman was contributing to the formation of the adult in the ways that no one in the medieval world could have articulated in those terms, but that the adult himself might, in some inarticulate way, have recognized. consider what it means that so many of the powerful men of medieval Europe, the kings and princes and great lords whose names fill the chronicles, were formed in their earliest years by the care of a woman who was not their mother. The medieval theory of milk kinship acknowledged this formative intimacy in its own terms, creating a legal and moral framework around the bond between the nurse and her nursling that implicitly recognized its depth. The term milk mother, which appears occasionally in the sources alongside wet nurse or nurse, captures something that the more clinical language of the profession does not. The sense that the nursing relationship was a kind of mothering, not identical to the biological mother's relationship, but not entirely separate from it either. A form of care that was intimate enough and prolonged enough to constitute a genuine bond. Some men, upon reaching positions of power, acted on this bond in ways that the records preserve. Edward IV's warm regard for his nurse has already been mentioned. Among the French kings, Charles VIII retained a close relationship with his nourrice throughout her lifetime, visiting her in her old age and providing for her financially in a way that went well beyond any formal obligation. Henry II of France maintained a similar relationship with his childhood nurse, and there are records of her visiting the court and being received with conspicuous courtesy decades after her period of service had ended. These examples are not typical. Most nurses disappeared from the record of great families almost as soon as their service ended. But they are not entirely anomalous either. They suggest that the bond formed in the nursery could, under favourable circumstances, persist into adulthood and be given, by those with the power to give it form, a recognition that it otherwise lacked. The nurse who was thus remembered was almost certainly exceptional. She had served a child who survived to adulthood and achieved great power. She'd performed her role with sufficient skill and care to leave a favourable impression, and she had the good fortune to be remembered by a person who chose to act on the memory. For every such nurse, there were hundreds who nursed children who died in infancy, or who served families that did not continue the relationship, or who performed their work well and were simply discharged, their contribution acknowledged in the wages and the parting gifts of the household account and nowhere else. The individual variation in outcomes was enormous, and it was determined by factors: the survival of the infant, the temperament of the family, the contingencies of political fortune that were entirely outside the nurse's control. The physical toll of the profession on the nurse's own body was real and cumulative. Prolonged nursing affected women's health in ways that were understood perfectly by medieval medicine, but that were nonetheless observed in practice. The suppression of ovulation that typically accompanies intensive nursing, a biological mechanism that served in pre-industrial populations as a form of natural birth spacing, meant that a wet nurse who nursed for 2 years was unlikely to conceive during that period, which in turn meant that her own family's growth was interrupted by her service. The nutritional demands of milk production, which could be substantial, placed additional strain on a woman's body at a time when many women were already nutritionally stressed by the cumulative effects of multiple pregnancies and periods of nursing their own children. A nurse who completed several terms of service over the course of her fertile years was a woman who had devoted a significant proportion of her physical capacity to the nourishment of other families' children, and that long-term effects on her health were not tracked by anyone who thought it worth tracking. The question of how the nurse's own body was affected by the cessation of nursing at the end of her service is one that the medical texts addressed, primarily from the perspective of avoiding the discomfort and health risks of abrupt weaning. The gradual process of reducing nursing that was recommended for the infant's welfare was also recommended for the nurse's physical comfort. The gradual drying up of the milk supply was less painful and less likely to lead to infection than the abrupt cessation that would occur if the service ended suddenly. In practice, the nurse who was dismissed at the end of a successful term of service would typically be given a period of time, measured in weeks, during which she gradually reduced the frequency of nursing before the final separation. This transition period was organised partly around the infant's needs and partly around her own physical management of the process. And it was during this time that the emotional dimensions of the ending were most acutely felt. The weaning feast. The formal celebration that marked the end of the nursing period was a recognised occasion in the great households of medieval Europe. It was not always elaborate, but in the wealthiest households it was a genuine ceremony, a moment of public acknowledgement of the milestone that the infant's successful weaning represented. The nurse was the central figure of this occasion, at least within the nursery and the women's household. She had brought the child to this point, and the feast was in part a recognition of her service. She received her final gift at or around this time, and the formal language of the farewell, whatever was said between the family and the nurse at the moment of parting, was the public punctuation of a relationship that had been, for the duration of her service, among the most practically important in the castle. After the weaning feast, after the final payment, after the parting gifts and the possible letter of recommendation and the farewell to the infant who would not remember her, after all of this she went home. The journey home, if she lived at any distance from the castle, was made under escort, with a man or two from the household detailed to see her safely to her own door. The roads of medieval England and France were not always safe, and a woman travelling alone with a considerable sum in wages and gifts was a target for the various forms of opportunistic violence that the roads presented. The household that had invested so much in managing her during her service was careful to return her safely to her family's keeping. She arrived home as a woman of some means, at least temporarily, and of enhanced social standing. She had served in a great house, and this was known, and it counted for something in the social calculus of her community. What she found at home had continued without her. Her husband had managed the household through the period of her absence, with whatever help was available. Her children had grown, and the children who had been infants when she left might, if she had been gone for 2 years, now be walking and talking and entirely alien to her, their daily lives organised around the people who had cared for them in her absence. The re-establishment of her domestic life required a kind of renegotiation of relationships that had been formed or altered without her, and this renegotiation was for some women difficult. These children who had been nursed by substitute care during her absence, or who had been weaned onto pap before they might otherwise have been, might bear the marks of that experience in ways that were visible, in growth patterns, in health, in temperament, or invisible. The nurse who had served successfully might return to her professional work relatively soon. If she became pregnant again and gave birth, she was once more a potential candidate for a nursing placement, and her previous service in a great household made her a desirable candidate. The cycle could repeat: another birth, another assessment, another period of service in another castle, another infant who was not her own nursed at her breast while her own child was cared for by other hands at home. Some women completed this cycle several times, becoming in the process genuinely experienced practitioners of an art that was as demanding as any craft practiced in the medieval world. The craft of wet nursing, if we are willing to use that word for it, encompassed knowledge that was partly biological, partly social, partly practical, and partly what we might now call psychological. The biological knowledge included the management of milk supply, the recognition and treatment of common complications, the assessment of the infant's nutritional state, and the dietary practices that supported health and milk production. The social knowledge included the navigation of the complex household hierarchies of the great families, the management of relationships with physicians and ladies and household officers, the understanding of the formal and informal protocols that governed the nursery. The practical knowledge included the physical techniques of nursing, swaddling, rocking, and soothing, the preparation of the supplementary foods used in weaning, the management of the nursery environment through the seasons, and the psychological knowledge, the most difficult to specify and the least acknowledged, included the ability to form and maintain the kind of calm, attentive, consistent relationship with an infant that supported its development, while simultaneously managing her own emotional life in a way that satisfied the medical theory of the passions and the practical demands of the household. This was not simple work. It was not work that any woman could do simply by virtue of having recently given birth and having milk. It was work that rewarded experience and intelligence and emotional regulation and social skill, and the women who did it well over multiple terms of service had developed a genuine expertise that was recognized, however imperfectly, by the families who competed for their services. The history of medieval medicine contains, scattered through its texts, a portrait of the ideal wet nurse that accumulates detail across centuries of writing and commentary. From Soranus of Ephesus, whose 2nd century work on gynecology remained influential throughout the medieval period, to the Arabic physicians whose works were translated into Latin in the 12th century, to the practical manuals written in the vernacular languages of the later Middle Ages for the guidance of noble households. This tradition of writing about wet nurses constitutes one of the more sustained examples of medieval attention to a specifically female professional role. The ideal nurse who emerges from these texts is, as we have seen, a woman of particular physical qualities, moral character, and dietary habits. But she is also, in the more thoughtful of these texts, a woman of specific emotional and psychological capacities, patient, even-tempered, attentive, capable of consistent care over a prolonged period, experienced enough with infants to recognize and respond to their signals without being told what to do, what these texts cannot capture because they were written from the outside by men who observed this profession rather than practiced it, is the interior experience of the work, what it felt like to be the woman whose body and time and attention were organized around another family's child. The medieval literature of female piety and devotion occasionally touches on this experience obliquely in the accounts of holy women who nurse sick or abandoned infants, in the imagery of the Virgin nursing the Christ child that was everywhere in medieval visual culture. The theological significance of nursing in medieval Christianity was considerable, and it gave the act of nursing a dignity and a sacred resonance that the wet nurse could, if she chose, apply to her own work. The Virgin who nursed the Christ child was the ultimate model of maternal care, and her image, her milk, her breast, her infant, was omnipresent in the religious art of the medieval world. The nurse who passed the chapel on her way to the kitchen, who saw the painted or carved image of the nursing Virgin above the altar, was living in a visual environment that made the act she performed each day a thing of sacred significance. Whether she thought of it in those terms is something we cannot know, The interior life of this medieval wet nurse is by its nature inaccessible to us. What we can say is that she lived in a world that understood nursing as one of the most fundamental human activities. Fundamental in the literal sense that infants could not survive without it, and that the great families of medieval Europe organised their most important domestic arrangements around the management of this activity. The wet nurse was the centre of this management, the person around whom the elaborate machinery of the nursery revolved, and her body was the site at which the most basic biological necessity and the most elevated social ambition converged. The necessity of infant survival and the ambition of dynasty, of lineage, of the continuation of a great name through time. That this convergence took place in a woman who was paid for it, who was examined and scrutinized and regulated and dismissed, who left behind only the faintest traces in the records of the household she served. This is a fact that says something important about the medieval world's relationship to the labour of women's bodies. The labour was necessary. It was recognised as necessary. It was compensated at the highest social levels at a rate that acknowledged its importance. And yet it was understood as natural to women in a way that made it less visible as labour, less worthy of sustained attention in the chronicles and the histories, less permanently commemorated than the labour of men who built walls and fought battles and administered estates. The castle's walls still stand in many cases. The wet nurse's milk is long absorbed into the bodies of people who have themselves dissolved into centuries of time. The philosophical tradition of the Middle Ages was not entirely silent on the question of what was owed to those whose labour sustained the social order. The literature of estates, the long genre of writing that described and evaluated the different ranks and occupations of medieval society, occasionally acknowledged the contributions of those whose work was most basic to survival. The ploughman who fed the realm, the craftsman who clothed it, the midwife who brought its children into the world, the nurse who sustained those children in their earliest vulnerability. These acknowledgements were not always accompanied by concrete improvements in the material or social conditions of those being acknowledged. But the acknowledgement itself, however formulaic, was a recognition that the social order rested on a foundation of labour that was performed in its most intimate and necessary forms by people who occupied the lower reaches of the hierarchy. Among these foundational labours, the nursing of infants deserves particular attention precisely because it is so intimate, so continuous, and so completely dependent on the willingness and capacity of a specific kind of human body, a woman's body in the weeks and months following childbirth. No technology of the medieval world could substitute for it. No alternative system could replace it at anything like the same reliability. The social arrangements that governed wet nursing in the great household were, ultimately, arrangements designed to secure the reliable performance of a labour that could not be mechanised, could not be delegated to a less skilled worker, could not be performed at a distance. The woman who did this labour was, for the duration of her service, indispensable, and the history that has largely forgotten her is, in its forgetting, enacting one more iteration of the failure to see what would always, even when visible, somehow not seen. We look at the great castles of England and France and Germany as they stand today, restored or ruined, and we imagine their medieval inhabitants in the halls and the towers and the great kitchens. We imagine the king at his council and the queen in her solar, and the knights in the yard and the servants at their work. We do not typically imagine in the upper rooms above the great hall A woman who is not sleeping because the child she nurses has woken again in the dark. A woman who has risen from her bed by the light of a banked fire and lifted the infant from his cradle and settled into the chair that has been provided for exactly this purpose, who holds him against her body in the particular way that she has learned is most effective for this particular child, who waits in the quiet and the darkness of a medieval castle night for him to finish nursing and to sleep. She is there. She's always been there in the castle nights of medieval Europe, feeding the heirs of dynasties, shaping in ways that no one then or now can fully calculate the people who would shape the world. Her name is sometimes recorded and more often not. Her story is recoverable only in fragments, through the imperfect medium of records that were not kept for her benefit. But she is there, and she is worth the act of imagination that allows us to see her. A woman in a warm room in a cold castle, nursing a royal child in the dark, doing the most necessary work in the world, in the way that necessary work has always been done. Quietly, without witness, and without expectation of being remembered. This is the history that lives in the spaces between the recorded events, in the hours between the midnight bell and the morning prayer, in the rooms that do not appear on the maps of the great castles because they were considered too ordinary to map. The nursery was such a room, ordinary in its furnishings, extraordinary in its significance, tended by a woman whose ordinariness was itself a kind of distinction, a reminder that the most fundamental human acts have always been performed by people whom the world has considered unremarkable, and that this unremarkability is itself a kind of historical claim on our attention. She rocked the child in the firelight. The castle breathed around her. Outside, the world continued its vast indifferent rotation. The stars moved in their courses, the seasons prepared their slow transformations. Inside, in the warm room, the business of sustaining a life continued, as it has continued in every generation since the first children were born and the first mothers, and then the first nurses held them and fed them and kept the cold away. The specific details change with the centuries, the particular castle, the particular family, the particular child. But the act itself is unchanged, and the woman who performs it occupies a place in the long history of human care that is as central as any other, however little the history books have thought to look for her there. Sleep, the medieval physician said, was when the body repaired itself. Sleep was when the humours found their proper balance and the day's disturbances were resolved. Sleep was necessary for health, and the nurse who did not sleep could not perform her work, and the infant who did not sleep could not grow. In the great castle, in the upper rooms, when the fires had burned low and the last sounds of the evening had faded, the distant bell of the night watch, the settling of the timbers, the faint sounds of animals in the yard, there was this, the quiet of a woman and a child, both finally asleep, the night doing its work around them, the castle's old stones holding their warmth for another hour before the cold came in again, the fire waiting to be banked before the morning began once more. There is another dimension of the wet nurse's life that we've touched upon but not yet fully explored. Her relationship to the language of the castle, to the particular ways of speaking and of being spoken to that governed the medieval household social life. Language in the medieval castle was itself a hierarchy, stratified by education, by regional origin, and by the complex overlapping registers of Latin, French, and the vernacular tongues that coexisted in the great households of England and France. Latin was the language of the church and of formal learning, used in the chapel and in the documents of administration. French, in England, the Anglo-Norman French, that had been spoken by the ruling class since the conquest was the language of the court, of the nobility, of the formal exchanges between social superiors. English, in its various regional forms, was the language of the majority of the population, and it was the language that the wet nurse, as if she was English, most likely spoke as her mother tongue. The linguistic environment of the nursery was therefore the first linguistic environment of the royal or noble infant, and the language that the nurse spoke to him was the language he first heard. This had consequences that medieval writers were aware of, though they discussed them primarily in terms of the propriety of language, rather than in terms of the kind of first language acquisition that modern linguistics would analyse. A nurse who spoke only English would speak English to the infant. An infant who spent his first 2 years hearing primarily English would form his earliest linguistic impressions in that language, whatever French he was taught subsequently. Medieval writers sometimes worried about the corrupting influence of nurses' vulgar speech on the linguistic formation of noble children, and the recommendations in the conduct literature for choosing a nurse with good speech that was clear, moderate in tone, neither rough nor coarse, were partly motivated by this concern. The nurse's speech was understood as a kind of formation. The words and rhythms and sounds she used in the nursery became part of the infant's earliest experience of human language, and this experience was thought to leave traces. The lullabies she sang, the prayers she recited, the gentle commentary she offered on the objects and events of the nursery world. All of this constituted, in the understanding of the time, an investment in the child's future capacity for speech and thought. The medieval world had a sophisticated understanding of the importance of early language exposure, even if it expressed this understanding in terms quite different from those of modern developmental linguistics. The nurse who sang well, who spoke clearly, who introduced the infant to the sounds and structures of human communication with patience and consistency, was performing a service that went beyond the merely nutritional. The religious dimensions of this early language formation were also significant. The prayers that the nurse recited in the nursery were among the first linguistic patterns the infant encountered. The measured rhythms of the Our Father and the Hail Mary, the particular cadence of the liturgical formulas that structured the medieval day. That the first words many noble children learned to recognize were words of prayer was not an accident, but a deliberate intention of the households that managed the nursery. The nurse was the first teacher of religion, as well as the first teacher of language, and these two functions were understood as inseparable in a world where the religious formation of the child was considered among the most important tasks of the early years. The sensory world of the medieval nursery was richer than we might expect, given the material simplicity of the period. The castle's wealth expressed itself in the nursery through specific objects: the carved and curtained cradle, the fine linens that were changed regularly, the woolen blankets of good quality, the small devotional images that decorated the walls, the brass or silver vessels used in the infant's care. These objects were chosen with attention to their sensory qualities, as well as their practical function. The smooth wood of the cradle, the softness of the linen against the infant's skin, the warmth of the fire's light on the plastered walls. The nurse inhabited this sensory environment continuously, and became, through her constant presence, its animating centre, the source of warmth and milk and sound and touch that organized the infant's early experience of the world. Medieval medicine paid considerable attention to the infant's early sensory development, recommending the stimulation of the infant's senses in appropriate degrees. The nurse was advised to speak and sing to the infant, to touch him with warmth and gentleness, to allow him to see appropriate objects, to introduce him gradually to the sounds of the castle's life, the bells, the voices, the distant music of the great hall on feast days, while protecting him from sounds that were too loud or too sudden. This guidance reflected an understanding, however theorized in different terms, that the infant's developing nervous system needed both stimulation and protection, that the environment of the nursery should be neither so dull as to deprive the infant of necessary experience, nor so stimulating as to overwhelm his developing capacity for response. The management of the nursery's acoustic environment was therefore part of the nurse's work. She regulated the sounds that reached the infant. She managed the visitors who came to the nursery, ensuring that they were sufficiently quiet and that their excitement did not disturb the infant's rest. She managed the sound of her own activities, her movements through the room, her conversations with the servant girl who assisted her, so that they provided a gentle acoustic background rather than a jarring interruption. She was the curator of the nursery's soundscape, as she was the curator of its warmth and its cleanliness and its supply of food and care. The great castle's kitchens produced, in the course of a year, an enormous variety of food: roasted meats, boiled pottages, fresh bread baked daily, pastries and subtleties for feast days, preserved foods for the long winters, fresh vegetable and fruits in season, fish on fast days, game from the surrounding forests, dairy products, eggs, ale, wine for the family and the upper household. The nurse's diet drew on this abundance in specific and constrained ways. She had access to the best of the ordinary provisions, and was specifically allocated the foods that were thought to support milk production, while being systematically excluded from the foods that were thought to harm it. She ate at a specific time and at a specific table, and her meals were monitored, at least in theory, by whoever was responsible for ensuring that she maintained the dietary regimen her position required. The cook who prepared the nurse's food knew her requirements, and accommodated them as a matter of professional routine. The great kitchen of a medieval castle served dozens or hundreds of people each day, and the management of individual dietary requirements, the religious fasts, medical prescriptions, the special needs of the sick or the pregnant or the nursing, was a normal part of the cook's administrative responsibility. The nurse's requirements were among the more specific and consistently maintained of these, because the consequences of neglecting them were understood as falling on the royal infant rather than merely on the nurse herself. A cook who sent the wrong food to the nurse's table was not merely failing the nurse, he was potentially harming the heir, and this was a responsibility that the kitchen staff took seriously. The bread that the nurse received was white bread, made from the most carefully sifted flour, well leavened, baked in the castle's own ovens. In the hierarchy of medieval bread, white bread occupied the highest position. It was associated with lightness, purity, and easy digestion, and it was the bread of the wealthy and the well-born. The nurse's access to it was a material mark of her temporary elevation, a daily reminder in the form of the bread on her table, that she occupied a special position in the household's provisions. The coarser bread, dark, dense, made from less refined flour, sometimes incorporating rye or barley or even oats, was the bread of the lower servants and the outdoor workers, and its absence from the nurse's table was as meaningful in the social vocabulary of the castle's food as the presence of the white loaf. The great hearths of the medieval kitchen were the castle's primary source of cooked food, and they burned almost continuously through the year. Great fires of wood and sometimes charcoal, tended by kitchen boys whose work was unceasing and whose proximity to the heat was, over a course of years, damaging to the eyes and the skin. The roasting spits turned by hand or by dogs trained to run in wheels. The great iron pots hung over smaller fires for the boiling of pottages and stews, the baking ovens heated to the required temperature and then sealed to bake their charges as the fire died down. All of this constituted the productive machinery of the castle's nutritional life, and it ran without stopping from the first light of morning to grow well after the last meal of the evening. The nurse moved through this world of food preparation as a specific kind of customer, not someone who worked in the kitchen, but someone whose needs the kitchen served in a particular and attentive way. Her relationship with the cook and his assistants was one of the minor social negotiations of her daily life. She needed their cooperation to maintain the diet her position required, and she needed to ask for this cooperation in terms that were neither too demanding nor too deferential. The cook was a senior member of the household service staff, with his own standing and his own professional pride, and a nurse who treated him with contempt or condescension was likely to find her special requirements met with less than complete reliability. A nurse who treated him with the appropriate mixture of respect and clarity, who communicated her needs directly and acknowledged his expertise in meeting them, was more likely to receive consistent and high-quality service. These small daily negotiations were the texture of the nurse's social life in the castle. They were not recorded in the household accounts. They were not mentioned in the chronicles. They were simply the practical work of managing a complex social environment with the limited leverage that her position provided day after day through the months and years of her service. The accumulation of these small daily acts of navigation, of reading the social situation correctly, of asking for what she needed in terms that would be heard, of maintaining good relationships with the people whose cooperation her work depended on, was itself a form of labour, invisible and uncompensated but essential to ability to perform the visible work for which she was paid. The wet nurse's position in the household, when viewed from the full breadth of a career that might span multiple placements over a decade or more, reveals itself as a form of professional life that was structured by a combination of physical capacity, social skill, accumulated knowledge, and historical contingency in proportions that varied from one placement to the next. The physical capacity declined with age, as the intervals between births lengthened, and the body's resources were gradually consumed by the repeated demands of pregnancy and nursing. The social skill and the accumulated knowledge, however, increased with experience, and might remain valuable even after the physical capacity to nurse had ended. A woman who had nursed in several great houses over the course of her career had a knowledge of household management, of infant care, and of the social world of the castle, that could be turned to account in various ways, as a servant in a household that valued her experience, as a midwife or wise woman in a community, as an informal advisor to younger women beginning their own careers in nursing. The transition from active wet nurse to elder woman of experience was a transition that the historical record almost never documents, because the historical record was not interested in the ordinary lives of women of the middling sort once those lives had ceased to be relevant to the interests of the great families they had served. But the transition happened, and the women who made it carried with them into old age a store of knowledge and experience that was, in its own way, a kind of wealth, not the kind that could be inventoried in a household account or conveyed in a will, but the kind that expressed itself in the authority that comes from having seen and done a great deal, and from having survived. The long arc of a medieval woman's life, when that life had included one or more terms of service as a wet nurse, was a life shaped by the particular rhythms of the work. The alternation between the ordinary domestic world of her own family and the exceptional world of the great house, the cycle of pregnancy and birth and nursing and return that structured her fertile years, the accumulation of wages and gifts and connections and knowledge that each term of service added to her store. It was not, by the standards of the time, a bad life, if she was fortunate enough to remain healthy and to find good placements and to return home to a family that had survived her absences. It was a life of specific demands and specific rewards, organised around the fundamental biological capacity that the world had decided was hers to offer. We are left, at the end of this account, with something that resists the neat conclusions that formal history likes to offer. The wet nurse does not fit easily into the standard narratives of medieval life. She is not a saint or a queen or a peasant or a merchant. She is not a victim, though she bore real costs, nor a heroine, though her work was genuinely important. She is a specific kind of person who occupied a specific kind of position in a specific historical world, and the specificity of her situation is both what makes her interesting and what makes her difficult to generalize from. She tells us something true about medieval society, but the truth she tells is particular and contingent, resistant to the kinds of broad claims that are easier to make about the more visible figures of the period. What she tells us, above all, is that the most fundamental forms of human care have always been performed by people whose labour was undervalued by the social order in which they worked. This is not a discovery unique to the study of wet nursing. It is a pattern that repeats across virtually every form of care work in virtually every historical period. But the wet nurse makes this pattern unusually vivid, because her work was simultaneously so basic and so consequential, so intimate and so unacknowledged, so clearly necessary to the survival of the family she served and so thoroughly forgotten by the histories those families generated. She fed a royal child. The child grew up. The castle endures in stone. The nurse's name, if it was recorded at all, is in an account book somewhere in a record office that preserves the household finances of a great medieval family. Her milk is gone. Her voice is gone. The particular way she had of soothing the infant in the night hours is gone. But she was there, and the infant she fed was formed by her care in ways that neither of them could have articulated, and the world was in some small and unmeasurable way different because of what she did, in the quiet and the warmth of the upper rooms, while the castle slept around her and the fire burned low, and the night moved through its hours toward the morning that would come, as it always did, whether or not anyone was watching for it. This is the strange and quiet dignity of her profession, and this is her claim on our attention. Not that she was grand or famous or powerful, but that she was necessary and present and careful in her work, and that the work she did sustained the life that the castle's grander narratives were built upon. The history we know was fed, at its beginning, by women whose names we mostly do not know. In learning their names, in trying to understand the texture of their leaves and the specific demands of their work, we're doing something that the making of history has not always sought to do. We're looking at the foundation and acknowledging that it was laid by human hands, and that the hands that laid it deserve to be seen.